It was a cold, rainy night in the small town of Blackwater, Maine, where the streets were slick with rain and the fog hung heavy in the air. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes just before something terrible happens. And on the night of November 3rd, 2016, something terrible did happen. The story began with a Greyhound bus that had been traveling from Boston to Montreal. The bus was scheduled to make a brief stop in Blackwater to pick up passengers, but when it arrived, the driver noticed something strange. There was a man sitting in the back of the bus, his face obscured by a hood, his hands resting on his knees. The driver didn't remember him boarding, and when he checked the passenger manifest, the man's name wasn't on the list. The driver approached the man, asking for his ticket, but the man didn't respond. He just sat there, silent and unmoving. The driver, unnerved, decided to let it go. It was late and he just wanted to finish his route. But as the bus pulled out of Blackwater, the driver couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The feeling only grew stronger as the bus made its way through the winding roads of rural Maine. The rain was coming down harder now, and the fog was so thick that the driver could barely see the road ahead. The other passengers were quiet, some dozing off, others staring out the windows at the endless darkness. And then, about an hour into the trip, the bus broke down. The engine sputtered and died, leaving the bus stranded on the side of a deserted road. The driver tried to restart the engine, but it was no use. They were stuck. The passengers began to grow restless, their voices rising in frustration. The driver got on the radio to call for help, but the signal was weak, and he couldn't get through. He decided to walk to the nearest town to get help, leaving the passengers on the bus. As the driver disappeared into the fog, the passengers settled in for what they thought would be a long wait. But then, one by one, they began to notice something strange. The man in the back of the bus, the one who hadn't been on the manifest, was gone. His seat was empty, and there was no sign of him anywhere on the bus. At first, no one thought much of it. Maybe he had gotten off when the bus broke down. But then one of the passengers noticed something else. The window next to the man's seat was open, just a crack, and there were muddy footprints on the floor leading to the door. The passengers began to panic. Where had the man gone? And why had he left the bus in the middle of nowhere? They decided to search the bus, hoping to find some clue as to who he was and where he had gone. But what they found only deepened the mystery. In the overhead compartment above the man's seat, they found a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, the ink smudged and faded with age. The first entry was dated October 31st, 1976, and it was written in a shaky, almost frantic hand. "I can't take it anymore. The voices, the shadows, the feeling that I'm being watched. They're real. I know they are, and they're coming for me." The passengers flipped through the journal, their hands trembling as they read the entries. The writer described strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, disembodied whispers, and the constant feeling of being watched. The final entry was dated November 3rd, 1976, and it was written in a single hurried sentence. "They're here. God help us all." The passengers were horrified. What had they stumbled into? And who was the man who had left the journal behind? They decided to search the bus again, hoping to find some clue as to his identity. But as they did, they began to notice something else. The bus was changing. The seats were older, the upholstery frayed and faded. The windows were fogged over, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The passengers looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. What was happening? And then they heard it, a low, guttural voice coming from the back of the bus. "You shouldn't have come here." The passengers turned to see the man standing in the aisle, his face still obscured by his hood. But there was something different about him now. His clothes were tattered and stained, and his hands were twisted into claws. He took a step forward, and the passengers screamed, scrambling to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The doors were locked, and the windows were sealed shut. The man advanced, his voice growing louder and more menacing. "You're mine now." The passengers huddled together, their hearts pounding as the man reached for them. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The bus was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the engine. The passengers looked at each other, their faces pale with shock. What had just happened? And where had the man gone? They decided to search the bus one last time, but there was no sign of him. The journal was gone too, as if it had never existed. The driver returned a short time later, a tow truck in tow. He found the passengers shaken but unharmed, their faces pale with fear. They told him what had happened, but he didn't believe them. It was just a story, he said, something they had imagined in the heat of the moment. But the passengers knew better. They had seen the man, heard his voice, felt his presence. And they knew that whatever he wasn't human. The bus was repaired, and the passengers continued on their journey. But none of them ever forgot what had happened that night. And none of them ever rode a Greyhound bus again.